5 in a preschool in Ann Arbor, and I've been observing kids in lots of different countries, 10 years in Canada, a year in Spain, a year in France, and even Africa, and getting a sense of how preschool programs around the world operate. And today our focus is on assessment. The comment was made a few minutes ago about all the hours that you need per year for training. And it occurs to me that, you know, it doesn't pay to get the same information over and over. And in our format, we don't want to give you the same information from week to week either. So today, in the first half, we're going to focus on assessment. And assessment techniques that are used widely and are used by preschool teachers. You guys. And I notice, like my sample of 2,000 preschool teachers, 90% of whom are female, that our man Kevin over here is it. And that is typical, guess what, worldwide.
How do we measure up?
Huh?
How do we measure up to other countries?
Oh, pretty well. Pretty well.
Good to know.
You know, it's true that I think every country on earth is interested in and invests in their children. You could kind of assume that. Even if they don't have a lot of material resources. And then a lot of countries do have. You know, but the U.S. has a pretty good program. You know, and in our program here at the university, I know, relative to inner city programs that I've worked in, that this is not a random sample that Kevin is dealing with. We have kids with extensive vocabularies, both parents or faculty, and you know, they are not quite a typical sample. So we've taken great pains in our research to sample truly a representative sample. When we say that, we mean by area of the country, by race, by gender, by ethnicity, by social class, so that you get a real robust sample. And we'll be talking about that. My plan for this evening is to keep my discussion brief, relatively brief. I mean, I am a college professor. We're all somewhat verbose. So it'll be an hour, roughly. Then we will have the opportunity to break up into smaller groups. And I noticed a lot of you came in pairs or trios, and you should break up that pairing so that you get with people that you're not working with. You know, that I think will be more informative as we get into these small group discussions. And we'll probably have 2 or maybe 3 groups that'll allow you a bit more opportunity to interact. And I think, given that you've all worked a full day already, we're aware that, you know, after an hour of presentation, you'll have had it. And I'll have had it. So
I'm going to head out. I will see all of you folks next week, because I'll be presenting again next week. All right?
Sounds good.
Thank you. If there's any questions, you know how to reach me by email. Thank you, Peter.
adios, Kevin.
Thank you, Marcus.
Not a problem. Thank you for the goodies.
Now, one of the aspects that I share with Cindy, who you heard on the very first week. What happened there, Marcus? I did that. Boy, this is delicate. One of the aspects I share with Cindy, both of us have a focus on the social and emotional aspects of development. And I have studied cognitive development. I don't take it for granted. And of course, when I say social, I mean cognitive. Of course, everything that's social has quite a lot of cognitive accents. And of course, that's what changes dramatically from 2 to 4 to 8 or 10. And when we study emotion, and we study it in different age groups, it is more the cognitive component of emotion that's undergoing change. So there's cognition in here. But we're not interested in talking to you today about teaching preschoolers arithmetic, colors, shapes, or whatever. We're really interested in the preschool as the first social group outside the family, and families are shrinking. It's the first social group that children belong to. It's the first time that they're aware of these small group dynamics. It's their introduction to the culture as a whole, to group living, to group life. And one of the first things that you notice as a research psychologist in a preschool program is how different kids are on day one, and particularly day one. When they come in, some kids are ready to go. Bold, exuberant, they even need to be kind of held back a little bit and given some rules. Other kids are entering the same classroom for the first time and real hesitant. Don't want to let go of mommy's hand. And when mommy leaves, there might be some tears, and this may happen for the first week, sometimes longer, and occasionally with Kevin, we will say to the parents, not ready. For example, we had a little Japanese girl, and she just was crying and vomiting and doing all kinds of things for week after week. And then we learned that the parents had just arrived from Japan. She didn't understand any English. She had left her principal caregiver behind, her grandma. So she was going through a lot of turmoil just with the transition. And now to be outside the family, which offered some continuity, too much. We were all set in January. This was in September. And we said by mid-September, no, got to come back in January. We were all set in January to deal with this difficult case. Guess what? No problems. None. She had made the adjustment, and now she was ready to go. So why give her all this added grief? Occasionally, kids aren't ready. Now, when we look back at the history of this field, which started really about the beginning of the 20th century, some of the earliest researchers were asking questions like this. When is social competence acquired? Emotional maturity, self-control, and again, tantruming, angry, aggressive behavior. And it was understood that during the preschool years, from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, we saw basically a decline in disruptive behavior, oppositional behavior, angry, aggressive behavior, and a rise in social competence. And one of the first researchers to document this was Florence Goodenough, and she used the method of questioning mothers about the frequency of these behaviors, and she described a developmental trend in which anger and aggression peaked at age 2, and then steadily declined throughout the preschool years, though it remained more common, she noted, in boys rather than girls. Sound familiar? And we recently conducted a study that asked that question and more questions. Instead of mothers, we used preschool teachers as informants. And we had 800 preschool teachers in 12 countries. A lot of different continents are represented, a lot of different cultures are represented in the list. They evaluated 4,000 preschoolers using the inventory that you have in front of you, the social competence and behavior evaluation inventory, which we developed to assess patterns of social competence, emotion regulation, emotional expression, and adjustment difficulties that preschoolers exhibited. And we drew these items from observational research, and we phrased them in ways that were clear, what we were talking about. The behaviors, that is, were observable. It was nothing like, this child shows a successful resolution of the Oedipal conflict, or anything like that. As you'll see in a minute, the items are very clear. And one of the most remarkable things about the study was that with 80 items reduced to a shorter version of 30, in every culture we found the same breakdown in terms of how the items group together. We call this a factor analysis. So the three factors that emerge, you'll see in a minute. One was a positive pro-social style, which we labeled social competence. Another factor was behavior that was anxious, withdrawn, and even depressed at the extreme. And then another one was angry, oppositional behavior. If I step on this wire behind me, I think we get a problem, so I'm going to get rid of it. And this basic division that we see here between what we're calling anxious, withdrawn behavior and angry, aggressive behavior is universal in psychiatry, in child psychiatry, in children, in adolescents. It's referred to by different terms in different eras: internalizing, externalizing, or conduct disorder, affective disorder. There's a lot of terms for it. One other terminology: under-controlled, over-controlled. And when we investigate this at the preschool level, we want things kept simple. We're not talking about psychiatric disorders. These are adjustment difficulties. These kids need a little guidance and a little structure. And so let's look under the hood and take a look at how this questionnaire actually works. And you have it in front of you. And a teacher would be given this to evaluate a child, and here you have a list of behaviors that you may observe when the child is in your care. Circle a number that reflects the frequency of the behaviors that you observe for the child, from never to always, right, on a continuum. That's a typical Likert kind of formula. Let's look at the behavioral items. And these were not, again, we generated 80 items and tested 80 items, but then distilled a 30-item set. And without going into the details of the analyses, which you can read in publications, the 30-item set was just as good as the 80-item set. And so, given how precious your time is, we didn't use any more items than we had to. You can't describe children with 1 or 2 items. But 30, you could begin to get a picture of who that child is and how they're adjusting at a particular time. So the first factor, you can see the items are readily observable in the preschool classroom. This child frequently helps with everyday tasks, or never helps with everyday, or somewhere in between. So remember, you're rating these on a continuum. This child accepts compromises when reasons are given, takes pleasure in their own accomplishments, negotiates solution to conflict with other children, will actually step in and help out, and cooperates with other children. They take other children and their point of view into account, a cognitive item. They comfort or assist another child in difficulty. They share toys. They're attentive toward younger children. They work easily in a group. And this is the type of child you wouldn't mind taking home. There are such children, are there not? I mean, and you didn't do anything. They came to you that way. And your job is to reinforce all these positive behaviors and make sure they're continuing in this vein. But not all children exhibit these behaviors. Some children are actually low in social competence. And as we'll see, this is a developmental thing. Younger kids, 3-year-olds, are much lower in all these things than 5-year-olds. And we'll show you that data in a minute. Now, the next factor we labeled anxious withdrawn. And again, we didn't choose these items. These came out of a factor analysis which essentially clusters the descriptor items that form a group that are consistently rated similarly by all the teachers. And so this is the group of items that emerge. Maintains a neutral facial expression, doesn't smile or laugh. So you can rate this always. This kid just never smiles. It doesn't really show any real emotion. Or you would rate it as, well, no, they're always exuberant. Tired. We never would have picked that one out ourselves, but that emerged. Tired. Might be an early signal of depression or sadness in a child. Worries. A worried look. Anxious. Timid. Afraid. Avoids new situations. Sad, unhappy, or depressed. Inhibited or uneasy in the group. Inactive, watches other children play, remains apart, isolated from the group, doesn't talk or interact during group activities, goes unnoticed in a group. And one of the things we found is that children like this, other children couldn't name them. They could name a lot of their classmates. And similarly, these children could hardly name any of their peers after a 3-month period, which is unusual. And then finally, the third group. These are the items in the angry, aggressive set. Easily frustrated. Gets angry when interrupted. Opposes the teacher's suggestion. Irritable. Gets mad easily. Forces other children to do things they don't want to. Hits, bites, or kicks. That physical aggression. Gets into conflict. Hits the teacher. Destroys things when angry with the teacher. Screams or yells easily. Defiant when reprimanded. Those were the 10 that jumped out of the larger set that teachers were endorsing as a group. And of course, and we'll talk about them in the reverse order, and of course, this type of behavioral problem is easily recognized and noticed. And in fact, the kids are aware of children that exhibit this profile. Certainly you as teachers are aware. As I was saying when Kevin is here, we could hardly study this phenomenon at the Child Study Center because we just didn't have enough kids who show these kinds of behaviors routinely. Let me give you a little more background on how we use this questionnaire. This is not used early in the year. We would say minimally 3 months. Teachers must have a group of kids for 3 months before they would evaluate anybody. That allows for the kids to actually make an initial adjustment. And so that anxious behavior that you see the first week wouldn't be scored. It's the chronic anxious withdrawn behavior that is there 3 months later that we're interested in. Not whether they're fast or slow to adjust to the group. Similarly, these behaviors, these would also have to be chronic behaviors that are maintained over time. And they involve a basic inability in emotion regulation, an inability to tolerate frustration, regulate anger, and basically control aggressive impulse. And this problem is referred to conduct disorder, externalizing, or under-controlled behavior, depending on the theoretical orientation of the speaker. In preschool, again, we would avoid using anything like conduct disorder or anything that smacks of DSM and keep it at a descriptive level. So our choice of terminology is angry, aggressive. The anger was new. People had scales of aggression, but when this was developed, there was nothing that dealt with emotion regulation. And yet what we saw was that the items that tapped emotion, particularly, were really prominent in the scale. The highest factor loading in all 4 U.S. samples was irritable, gets mad easily. So it is the emotional regulation that gives rise to the problem of aggression. There's no check or inhibition. If they, and particularly if they get mad easily, then you're going to see a higher frequency of aggressive behavior. Poor frustration tolerance and defiance were also really high up in the factor loadings. Children with extreme scores on this scale tend to express their negative emotions in ways that hurt or at least disturb others. And when I say extreme, we were interested, among other things, you can imagine all of these behaviors as falling on a normal distribution. So you could say, at what cutoff point do you think this is significant, that it's truly a problem? Some children exhibit these behaviors. You know, a lot of children from time to time will exhibit these behaviors. But at what point in a sample would this be a problem? And we looked at a 20 percentile, a 20% cutoff, too generous. 10% was more like it, or even a little less than that, depending on your sample. 10%. Now, when I say depending on your sample, we would not have 10% in the extreme end of this measure at the Child Study Center. We just wouldn't. But if we went into inner city Philadelphia, we might have more than 10% in a given classroom. So we're using national norms. And that's one of the advantages of this measure, is that it's normed nationally. So you can fill it out for a given child, and you can find out this child is scoring at this percentile. And as you'll see in a minute, you would need to calibrate that by their age and by gender to get to that understanding of how extreme is their behavior. How extreme is the behavior of this child? And that's something that, as teachers, you're more aware of than parents. And there are other reasons why we wouldn't use parents as evaluators. But certainly one reason is that you have a better sense of the relative problem. How extreme is this problem in this child? You would have a better sense of that because you've seen more kids. And again, so extreme scores here, 10%. That is 90% of the kids show fewer problems of this sort. And these kids then function poorly in most social situations. They require constant supervision. And often to protect others from outbursts, picking up a metal truck and hitting a kid with it, that kind of thing. You gotta watch it. They are the most interactive with their peers, observational research. They interact a lot. They may even be hyperactive, some of them. But they're also the most rejected using peer sociometrics, which Cindy talked about. They get negative nominations. We have kids that get negative nominations for every child in the group. And that's really peer rejection. And of course, this is what we would expect, since aggression is probably the key variable associated with peer rejection. Boys were rated higher on this scale than girls. Younger preschoolers showed more of this behavior than older. And in 12 cultures, all of these gender differences were replicated. Age differences were found in many cultures, but not in Japan and Italy. And I could come back and discuss that when we're done. But by and large, the age differences also held up. Now, if you look at your sheets, there's one, I think the third one in, that shows graphs. And you can see all three scales. And this is the US sample, a sample from Boston, Denver, Miami, Maine. And so this is the page that you're looking at. And you can see angry, aggressive behavior is in decline by age, a stepwise decline. And you can see that at each age group, boys are higher than girls. Okay? Then in the second graph down, and this is again for the U.S. national sample. In the second graph down, social competence, I might have handed out the wrong one. You're looking at the Quebec sample. I'm sorry. Yeah.
When you said it declined, I thought I was reading it wrong.
Yep, no. I'm going to get you the right one upstairs. The Quebec sample was actually a clinical sample. We were interested in looking at problem behavior, so we really went into inner cities and got a clinical sample. So I'm not gonna refer to that handout. Okay. Any questions about assessing this? This is probably the easiest job, and there are lots of instruments at the preschool level that can do a pretty good job of targeting and indexing this, because, again, by definition, the word externalizing behavior, these behaviors are right in your face. They're right out there. They're noticed, and because they are disruptive, they're noticed by the kids as well. So I don't think that there's a particular difficulty with assessing this kind of problem. It's relatively easily assessed. What we added to the dimension is the emotional qualities. The anxious withdrawn behavior is a little trickier to assess. And again, one of the fundamental differences here is between shyness and anxious withdrawn behavior. We know that some kids are temperamentally shy. We know from MMPI studies over a 30-year period that shyness is one of the most stable personality traits that we can assess. If you're a shy person, you're shy as a 4-year-old, you're shy as a 14-year-old, and you're shy as a 40-year-old. Johnny Carson was shy, but he gave a evening show, and he had butterflies every time he did. So he could learn to accommodate this, but it didn't change the fact that he was a shy individual. If you saw him at a party, he would not be talking to too many people. He would go to people he knew, and he was shy around others. And so shyness is not what we're interested in here. Shy people can adjust to their temperament qualities and do quite well. What we're interested in assessing are children who are anxious and withdrawn, who are sad, who may in fact be exhibiting an early form of childhood depression. Now, depression isn't something we see in children, nor should we. How many children do you see that you would say are depressed? Very few, I would hope. It's not typical of childhood. You really begin to see it more in adolescence. And we see a sex difference in adolescence, favoring girls. We don't see that sex difference in preschool. Some kids are anxious withdrawn, and they are equally boys or girls. And they kind of stand out if you observe carefully. Children who illustrate this second type of problem withdraw from social contact in the face of distress or high levels of emotional arousal. May inhibit behavioral and emotional expression when aroused, that neutral phase. And so the items describe anxious, depressed, isolated, and overly dependent behavior. Emotional items on this scale describe a child who's often sad, worried, timid, afraid, and rarely laughs or smiles. Particularly, they avoid areas of the classroom where there's a lot going on, where there's high excitement. They prefer quiet activities, and they will seek out quieter parts of the classroom. They may not be noticeable because they're not causing problems in the group, like the angry, aggressive child. They're found in observational studies to interact significantly less, as you would expect. In peer sociometrics, they are not rejected by their peers, but they're not often nominated, and particularly in best friend nominations. They're rarely nominated as a best friend. They spend much of their time in activities on the periphery of group life, onlooking parallel play. They're also typically alone in the classroom, as much as you can be, right? That's a little tricky too. And they're often unoccupied. They're not doing much. In general, they're not really benefiting as much as they could from what's being offered in the program, in terms of, especially of social development. Children with extreme scores now, the 10%, are seen by their teachers as sad and depressed as well. They tend to have a poor self-image, show higher levels of immaturity. They often, for example, seek adult attention in situations that don't require it. They find it difficult to perform tasks within their capabilities without regular assurance. And they give up easily where other children persist, which is used to be called ego strength. It's an interesting characteristic. This child will persevere with difficulties and eventually succeed, whereas the other child gives up easily and doesn't succeed, but maybe could have had they persevered. And as I said, no gender differences on this scale, and that was also true across culture. So unlike the angry, aggressive behavior where boys, regardless of culture, were higher than girls, here, no sex difference, at least not at this age. There was an age difference. It was slight, with the younger kids showing more of this behavior than the older kids. And interesting, that pattern was reversed in China, with the older preschool kids showing more anxious, withdrawn behavior, particularly high in anxiety. And the Chinese investigators offered a pretty good explanation. In China, you're given tests at age 5. And they're going to determine whether you go to higher advanced instruction or not. Parents are aware of this, and it's a big advantage to score well on the test. And so it's communicated, and so that actually is interesting, because the U.S. is often considered to be a highly competitive culture. Not so fast, my friends. Not at this age group, not in general, and certainly not institutionally do we have this kind of thing. Yeah.
Don't they have a higher rate of suicide as well?
Yeah, they're showing this problem in Japan too.
Yeah, because they're so...
Yeah, and of course these cultures are changing fast, right? They're adopting Western modes of education and Western modes in general. And so there's some fallout here. And China is beginning, there are scholars in China that are beginning to be aware of this. They also have had a one-child policy.
Yes.
And that can be a lot of pressure on the single child to perform at age 5 and to get these good scores. So we thought interesting that would show up in the measure, right? We also thought, and I'll say something about Italy and Japan. Remember I said that the aggression declines. I gave you the wrong graph, but forget that. The aggression declines, and we thought this was a universal pattern. We thought this was developmental, universal. We're going to see this in every culture. Well, we saw it in most cultures, but not in Italy and not in Japan. And one thing that those two cultures have in common, the youngest child, especially in a family, is just treated like royalty. They're given a lot of affection. In Japan, it's called amai. They are treated with kid gloves. Their parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts just really lavish praise and affection on the child at a very young age. And they use this as a control technique. So that at age 3 or 4, if they do something wrong, now the parent is not so nice. They don't have to raise a hand or even a finger. They just tone down the positive, and that signal is heard by the child loud and clear. And they want to restore the positive. And visiting with Japanese psychologists and talking with them, it's clear that this kind of control permeates the culture. And so, for example, I saw these machines on the street in parks and public places. You could feed some coins in and get a beer. All right? 24/7. Not inside a store, out on the street. And so I was looking at these, and the first thing that occurred to me was, well, how do you keep like adolescents from just getting a beer whenever they want? And they said to me with a straight face, it's not allowed. That was their explanation. It's not allowed. And I thought, wow, that's certainly not going to work in the States whether we say it's allowed or not. We don't have that kind of control over behavior. But they do in a collective culture like Japan. They have that kind of control, and it's instilled in the family, and it's very interesting. So you don't see physical aggression. You rarely hear Japanese parents raising their voices. They don't have to go negative to bring the child back to good behavior. They just have to reduce the positive. And that's a loud enough signal. Now, one of the problems with certain American parents would be this, is they're already using a high degree of negative and very little positive. And they're trapped because there's no signal that they can send without just increasing the negative. That's the only thing left. They can't decrease the positive because there's not enough of it. And when we looked in research at the parenting styles that were associated with these patterns, it was the anxious, withdrawn child who had parents who were highly negative. We wrote a study called Balance of Power, where we argued that in certain families, kids have too much power, and they tend to be aggressive. In other families, parents have too much power, and the kids tend to be anxious and withdrawn. So we saw this pattern of behavior pretty clearly in filming kids in structured situations with their parents. Basically, it was a game, a fun game. And, socially competent kids and their parents had a great deal of fun playing it together. It was a novel game. Basically, they had a little man, a little figure that could go around a board. We had a big table set up, and it was laid out like a grocery store with all the items on shelves, all miniature. And you had to go find 5 items on a list. And you had to move the little guy through the store to get them. The idea was that you had to do this in the most efficient route possible. This exceeds what a preschool child can typically do. They're going to be more impulsive, and they're going to have a lot of fun. Now, the parent is there to help them. So under these circumstances, that little bit of structure and the parents with anxious, withdrawn kids just showed a lot of negative behavior, and the child was negative, and they just back and forth they went. And you could just show this beautifully on a film. They just got negative right away, and it was the parent who led, who initiated it. And the child responded with negative affect. And they just didn't seem to be able to get out of it. So parenting, as we'll see when we get to the end here, is one of the key factors. The family environment is one of the key factors that leads to the differences that you see when you meet a 3-year-old and a group of 3-year-olds and see that their behavior is quite different. It's the emotional climate in the home and the way that they've been parented is brought right to you And if that's going along winningly, you inherit the benefit. But in cases where parents are systematically reinforcing coercive behavior, for example, you inherit that too. Because the child will generalize that behavior pattern. So, enough on parenting. Point being made here is that a lot of these patterns are well established by the time they get to you. And then a little harder to break. Okay, let's get out of the good stuff. Social competence, this is sensitive pro-social behavior. Well-adjusted, these kids are flexible, they're emotionally mature, and pro-social. Emotional items on the scale emphasize emotion regulation, and including the child's ability to remain calm during conflict. Show pride and pleasure in their own accomplishments. Accept compromises cheerfully. Demonstrate empathic awareness of other children's needs and goals. Why is she crying? This kind of a question. Right? Showing an interest in the behavior. They're attentive toward younger children. They're attentive toward signals of emotional distress. So they show early empathy. Now, not surprisingly, they received the most positive nominations from their peers and the least negative nominations. High on measures of ego resiliency, a fancy term. Here's an example. Child is involved in a conflict. And this other child is behaving in a very provocative way. And now this child is in their face telling them, what's what. And they're kind of angry when they do it. But then 5 minutes later, or even less, they can be very positive toward the same child. They haven't held a grudge. They haven't kept that negative emotional arousal, even though they showed it. Unlike a more timid child, they were able to confront an aggressive peer. They will not be easily victimized. And these kids are appreciated by their teachers. Boys were rated lower on this scale, systematically, across culture. Younger preschoolers rated lower on this scale. Gender differences replicated in every culture, age differences replicated in every culture. So, what I would make of that is that the preschool programs tend to work. When kids come in at age 3, they lack a lot of the competency that they leave with at age 6. And a lot of this is just development, right? Self-control is much more, the preschool child at age 6 is much more capable of self-control. And directing their attention. There are a lot of cognitive features to this. Sustained attention. A lot of things change from 3 to 6. Okay, now we can stop here for questions, or we can approach a different topic. As I said, these patterns that you see in certain kids are established before they get to you. And you then see the child now, maybe in a different situation, with lots of kids around them. But the pattern of their emotional regulation is already established. And where is that established? Well, we would say principally, the first most important factor, principally, would be in the primary care relationship with whoever that is. And that could be more than one person. And so we would link it with patterns of attachment. Patterns of attachment in the first 3 years predict substantial variance in preschool behavior in a lawful way. Having said that, let me just ask you, do you want to see some more of this data, or would you rather break now and have just a more open discussion. We can stop right here.
Keep going.
You ready for more?
Yes.
Okay. You may have had this in other situations, but this is something that has been researched widely in the last 10 to 15 years and can only be done in longitudinal research. You have to follow the kids over time. Now I'm going to skip some of the theoretical parts. So what we're talking about is, where does the child pick up messages about the self? Their self-esteem and their self-image is built over time. They're not born with a sense of self. This is from messages that they've received from their closest caregivers. So here is a quote from one of the attachment researchers. If an attachment figure frequently rejects or ridicules the child's bids for comfort in stressful situations, the child may come to develop not only an internal working model of the parent as rejecting, but also one of himself or herself as not worthy of comfort or help. So these are messages that get built in to the child's emerging sense of self. Alternatively, if a child experiences attachment figure as trustworthy, loving, and sensitive, the child is likely to form a related model of the self as lovable and worthy of help and comfort from others. So in talking about empathy, that would be one of the very first predictions made by attachment theorists. If you're in a relationship and your mother is showing care, sensitive caregiving, attention, and empathy, and you're on the receiving end of that for the first 3 years of life, that's your model of how relationships work. You take that and use it to build future relationships. And you learn both roles inside that relationship. The one who's appealing for help is also learning the role of the person giving the help. So these kids exhibit helpfulness and empathy in relation to younger kids in the preschool classroom. They've learned both sides of the relationship. It's also true, unfortunately, with the more negative relationships, where you're learning the role now. Let's say you're being victimized. You're not only learning the role of the victim, but you're also learning the role of the victimizer. You're learning both of those roles. And these are somewhat resistant to change once they're built. You can alter them, but they're somewhat resistant to change. And one of the reasons is self-fulfilling prophecy. The child tends to elicit this. And we saw, when we did this longitudinal study, we had children who were studied from birth, even before birth. Temperament, measures at birth, physiological measures, all kinds of measures, including several measures of attachment. Then we had them as preschool kids filmed every day in the classroom. And what we saw were children from disturbed attachment relationships, insecure relationships, were very provocative in their behavior toward teachers. And they could hook teachers in to a pattern of interaction that was established in the home, and that was negative. And that's what we mean by a self-fulfilling prophecy. Similarly, the kids with secure attachment relationships are really nice. They're smiling, they're friendly, they're expecting the same, and they tend to elicit that. Their teachers like them from day one. So one of the reasons that I present this is that you guys on the front lines may unwittingly play into a child's relationship system. They can provoke you into behaving in ways that fill their prophecy that the adult is this way. And so they tend to reinforce the relationship model that they've been developing. And this is one of the things, probably on the social emotional side, that I would say is one of the more subtle things that a preschool teacher can do to alter these developmental pathways that were initially negative toward more positive outcomes. The parent's approach to discipline is an important factor here. This comes after the attachment relationship, and particularly at age 2. And what we found is that you can study all these child-rearing practices, they don't seem to have any correlation or any effect. And so it isn't so much what the parent does in a discipline situation, it's how they do it. It's the quality, the emotional quality. And again, we see the emphasis on attachment here. As opposed to genetic, we don't see a lot of evidence from early assessments of temperament that these kids were born that way, that it's ingrained. Temperament is a reality, but temperament is not the same as these behaviors that we've been talking about, the angry, aggressive, and the anxious withdrawal. I'm going to move past the, I'm going to get to the preschool. Now, how many of you are familiar with the patterns of attachment? Secure, anxious, yeah. I know he is. When we look at positive attachments, which fortunately are 2/3 of the kids that you get have had a history of secure attachment. And they, compared to insecurely attached peers, are higher in their behavior, is more positive, they receive more positive behavior. This is the relationship building process. They definitely enjoy more positive and synchronous friendships, reciprocal friendships. They're viewed by their teachers as helpful, cooperative, independent, and socially competent. There's a lot of good things there. Here's a study, inner city study, Minneapolis, 180 kids from a high-risk inner city sample. And attachments were more likely to be insecure under these conditions. But this statistic here is addressing behavioral problems in the preschool. 85% of infants with stable insecure attachments, meaning at each assessment it was assessed as an insecure attachment, 85% of those kids show behavioral problems, clear behavioral problems in the preschool. That's impressive. I mean, that's how you have found a key predictor here. It's not just what SES you come from, but particularly the emotional climate of the home.
Is that an insecure attachment to the provider or to the parent?
Parent. Yep. The primary caregiver in this case was the mother, and often single parents. Right? High-risk sample. This is 60% when there's kind of a mixed pattern of attachment, where in some assessments it looks secure and others it doesn't. 29% was stable secure. 2 assessments, so this meant both times it was secure. You've gone from 85 to 29. Why is it so high? Well, there's a risk factor here. So be happy in your work, because you probably have the 66% that are showing secure patterns of attachment. Now,
Do you ever follow any of these children into
yes,
adulthood?
yeah. there's a whole book on this, and this study has been continuously funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and other granting agencies since 1974. And these kids have had kids. So we're looking at intergenerational transmission of attachment, behavior problems, and so on. And it's there, clearly is there. And it's not genetic. It's
So
not
they-
genetic.
So they never, they don't somehow get themselves out of it, they just.
Some do.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, some do. And the alternative is also true. Some children actually succumb to their environment, even though they had a secure attachment, but many fewer. That is, a secure attachment isn't some kind of immunity for life,
Right.
but it's certainly a leg up. It's a foundation for dealing with the problems of gangs, for example, in adolescence.
That's what I was thinking of.
You know, one of the securely attached boys that was part of the study of my dissertation. Very positive in the preschool, very competent, well liked, and of course, at that age, most of their friends are other boys. At, I think, age 10, witnessed his father's murder. That's a traumatic event. And then when we studied him as an early adolescent, 13, 14, he was very wary with adults. Right? Yeah. Adults that he didn't know. He was somewhat reserved with peers. But some of the nominations had to do with who would you like to be better friends with? This kid. So his reservation, he was a little bit aloof at that age. And since then has rewritten the ship. But it took years to come back out of that. So there are events that occur later in life that have a dramatic effect on social behavior. But the foundation that he had was eventually revealed as things progressed. Whereas other kids, without that foundation, get into gang life and now are in prison. And it's like, when do they get out of this cycle? Not because of prison. I mean, that's more protecting the society than benefiting the people who are incarcerated. So some of these patterns lead to difficulty, and one of the things that we're noticing with especially the angry, aggressive behavior is that it doesn't tend to stay the same and can become progressively more serious from early years to adolescent to early adulthood. And so it's important. I think the lesson here that people are learning is early intervention and prevention is really going to pay dividends, not dealing with serious behavioral problems in adolescence or young adult or early adulthood, where it's really difficult now to change the behavior. And sometimes you really can't. You're just giving up.
That's right.
So that leads to more interest in the early years and what predicts what, and finding out what patterns can be changed. So in this study, two patterns. I'm going to finish here with two patterns that give you a sense of the dynamic of this relationship process as it's worked out in early development for the first time, and then later in the preschool with new relationships that are being built according to a plan, right? So this is the anxious resistant plan. We have found that this particular pattern of attachment is a risk factor for the anxious withdrawn behavior I was describing earlier. When we look at these kids longitudinally, now this is before they get into the preschool, they're observed to be wary, easily upset. They're very difficult to settle once they're upset. They remain upset. They're characterized by a poverty of exploration. At times they show explicitly angry, tantrum behavior. And the pattern is based on inconsistent or chaotic care. So they have no sense of predicting when they are highly upset what their parent is going to do. The parent's sort of on their own schedule. They can sometimes be nice to the child, but it doesn't relate to the child's needs. Sensitive caregiving does relate to the child's needs, right? So these kids were found in this longitudinal study as preschoolers. They were low status and peripheral members of the peer group. Some exhibit extreme passivity and infantile dependence. Others are more forward, but become easily over-aroused and disorganized in the face of minor frustrations. And what we're thinking about is that these kids never really learned a smooth pattern of emotional regulation with the parent, where the parent provides the regulation. Right? The parent is helping the child cope and provides the regulation initially, but then that's internalized. And it wasn't internalized, so they still have problems. The anxious avoidant pattern does not lead to avoidant behavior. It leads to angry, aggressive behavior. This was sort of a conundrum. So this particular style is considered to be the foundation for a defensive personality that's characterized by hostility and negative expectations of others. Where does it come from? From caregivers who are physically cold and distant and rejecting, particularly when the child is distressed. So the child learns this pattern of coping. And preschoolers with anxious attachment histories of this sort express a lot more hostility and negative affect toward their peers, and for that reason were rejected by them. They had negative expectations of other people. And these kids were the ones that were most provocative to preschool teachers. And we had some really good preschool teachers that were clinically informed. But still, when we asked them, we would ask them questions like at the end, give me the first 3 descriptors that come to mind, and we'd show them a picture of the child. Oh, I'd love to take this kid home with me. She is always so, full of life, and, blah, blah, blah. Then another one. Oh, I'd like to stuff this kid into the basket sometimes. I have to just sort of get away before I do something I will later regret. And so, of course, the teachers are playing into these emotional patterns, right? That these kids elicit and provoke. And they are in free play, where we film them in sessions. These kids took advantage and mistreated their play partner. In all cases, the victimization, the exploiter had an avoidant history, the victim often had a resistant history. This was a very interesting part of the study where we paired them up by their attachment histories. It was interesting, it paired with this sort of victimizer, the securely attached kid did not become a victim. They really were capable of meeting this and standing up to it. But the kids who had an anxious resistant history, who were withdrawn and anxious, they were the ones. And when we saw this in the classroom, here's what it would look like. All right? Here's a kid with an anxious avoidant attachment pattern, showing the hostility and negative affect in a proactive way. So everybody is wearing costumes, really interesting hats they're putting on. They're dressing up. That's what's going on that day. And they're all having a lot of fun. Well, this little boy came along and knocked your head off. You didn't react. Knocked your head off. You didn't react. Knocked your head off, and you started to look, stayed right there. And we coined the term negative empathy. They were clearly reading the emotional signals. They found their victim and stayed right there. That is, they could find kids who didn't have the emotional resources to stand up to them. And like a lot of bullies, if somebody stands up to them, they get right out of there. They don't want to deal with that. They want to find a victim. So these kids are out there, and they're in relatively small numbers. Their behavior can provoke you guys, and occasionally you will meet up with them. I now see that we have a problem in Bangor. I was just hearing about it. 200 kids now in foster homes because their parents are taking bath salts? What is going on? Bath salts?
Sad.
Parents? I was really astonished. I was hearing this on the news driving over. And so that was sort of, so here in Maine, you're going to have types of problems that are going to come to you from the wider community. And if parents are doing things like bath salts and getting their kids into foster care, or even before they get into foster care, you may be inheriting some of these behavioral problems as early as age 3 or 4. And it takes a lot of training not to fall prey to the provocation that they provide you. It's just too easy to kind of get into the negative reciprocity that they tend to elicit from their parents. I'm sure most of your kids are doing fine, but then every now and then you're going to get a kid who just doesn't seem to respond to the positive climate that you create in the classroom. And they need not less, but more positive to disconfirm their self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm going to end there. We can open it up for a few questions, or we can just break now. I think probably most of you are ready for a break at 7:15. So why don't we take a break, and when we come back, we'll be in small groups.